Professor of Political Communication at the Institute of Communication Studies, University of Leeds. Over to you, Stephen. Oh, may I just say, one quick little note. John Corner sent his apologies and wasn't able to be here today, but we have loaded onto our website, Civic Culture's website, a link to his project, and he asked you all to please take a look at the current work that he's doing, with some information on the project and things that he's writing. So it's up on the site now. Indeed. So yeah, please take a look. I'm John Corner's #1 fan, if you don't know, and I thoroughly recommend them. But now,
thank you very much. Okay, no PowerPoint, no data. You've all been under the empirical cosh for long enough today. All the data that could possibly cast any light on anything has now been out there. No temptresses, no tempters. This is just what I have to say. My aim in what I have to say is to speak about the mediation of political debate from an entirely normative perspective. I want, in other words, to think about the norms that are required for political debate through the lens of historical contingency. That is to say, how have the norms of mediated political debate been imagined thus far, and how might we reimagine them? So let me start with a very obvious, but I think under-articulated point. Becoming an informed and vocal and active citizen is a demanding, relentless and thankless task. Global society is vast, issues are complex, change is often rapid, dramatic and unexpected, competing interpretations of events diverge wildly, the language of the well-informed tends to be opaque and uninviting. For most people, there simply aren't enough hours in the day to make sense of what's going on politically. So it's not surprising that all of the survey research that I have ever looked at finds very large sections of the population of even the most advanced and educated democratic states not really knowing what's going on, not being able to identify what the issues are, not being able to identify who takes which side, not taking a side themselves. Public confusion has come to be less an occasional failing of our society than a default setting. For all but the most fickle and dogmatic of us, the task of making up our minds about serious political questions is too difficult to be taken alone. We just can't do it on our own. Major social questions like who is a terrorist and who is a freedom fighter? When are failing banks something that we need to put our money into, and where is it a criminal conspiracy against us? When is media ownership something that can be more concentrated in order to provide for more technological innovation? And when is that a threat to democracy? Those kind of questions simply cannot be answered without a mass conversation taking place. A conversation from which no voices are excluded, no evidence suppressed, and no conclusions ruled out. So therefore, I want to make three foundational claims about what political debate needs. First of all, I want to argue that democracy needs debate even more than it needs voting. Secondly, I want to say that television is a central platform for that debate to take place, because television in almost every country of the world is still overwhelmingly the central medium. And thirdly, I want to say that at the moment, our political culture is characterised by a conspicuous absence of good debate, and that the noise signal ratio on most television discussions of politics does not serve democracy at all well. So let me just focus for a minute on those three foundational claims, because these are the ones I want you to subscribe to. First of all, why does democracy need debate even more than it needs voting? Imagine, if you will, a society in which there were 100% turnouts at every single election. We were all dutiful citizens going to vote, but nobody ever discussed the issues of the day with anyone beyond their own circle of friends or their own families. The likelihood of people ever changing their minds or shifting their preferences would be very slim indeed. It would be a society which had become sclerotic in terms of public opinion. Debate disrupts that kind of complacency because it exposes people to ideas different from their own and different from their immediate environments. And because answers to political questions are rarely obvious or singular, the more cross-cutting the exposure to the perspectives of others, the greater the likelihood at arriving at a subtle and sophisticated and sensitive conclusion. Hannah Arendt referred to democracy as a space of appearance, a space in which one can see and be seen. Because only when we can look at others in the eye can we hope to avoid looking through one another. So I want to insist that democracy needs spaces for public debate, not just between friends, but amongst strangers, amongst those who are our fellow citizens that we can never hope to like or even particularly understand. Only through such mutual exposure can we achieve the recognition that is the foundation of democratic respect. But debate never happens by accident, any more than polling stations start up by accident. Beyond the fortuitous occurrence of casual conversation, debate needs to be facilitated, and it has to be a means of throwing people together intellectually. This leads me to my second foundational claim that I want you to accept. That in a society like ours, television must be at the heart of political debate. Why so? Isn't it the case that television is in fact at the heart of anything that is distracting, that is dumbing down, that is devaluing of intellectual substance? No, it isn't. All of the empirical evidence, as most of you here will know, from research over half a century and more, shows that first radio and then television have become the key source of political information for most people most of the time. It's not only television that broke the events on 9/11 to us, but it was television that constructed the entire narrative which we use as a translation centre in our arguments with other people since then. It was not only television that told us that the banks were collapsing, but it had offered for most people in the world the only real explanation of that happening that they have been able to talk about with one another, albeit a skewed and incomplete explanation. Television doesn't tell us what to think, but it certainly tells us what to think about. So television may rarely offer the space of appearance that Arendt spoke about, but for most of us, it is our only means of exposure to other people. This leads me to my third and final foundational claim, which is that contemporary democracy is being shortchanged by television. Contemporary democracy doesn't get from television what it could and what it should. Too often it is characterised by the frustrating vacuity of the angry headline, the over-dramatised incident, the denunciating mob and a prevailing mood of cynical resignation. Contemporary politics all too often is abandoned at the level of substance to trivia and to the unrestrained uproar of virulence. All of this has had very troubling consequences for democratic citizenship. Firstly, when all of politics is made to seem either fraudulent or futile, then the most likely public response is for people to simply disengage, which in many cases they have done. Secondly, as the media have come to be characterised by intensified competition for public attention, their messages have tended to become increasingly consumed by sensationalism, a focus upon the ephemeral, headline-making demands, the latest example of corruption, and a perpetual search for inconsistencies, gaffes, sleights of hands, and people to blame. Thirdly, even when citizens do feel motivated to engage with public affairs through television, there is a growing gap between the long-term character of socio-political problems and the short-term pressures that tend to dominate the television agenda. This leads too often to a public discourse framed by the pragmatic priorities of immediacy, with both politicians and journalists strategizing in ways that ignore underlying problems and durable consequences. None of this is good for a democratic political culture, for a civic culture, as Peter Dahlgren has written about it. So if my foundational claims are even approximately correct, that democracy must have debate, it's not an added extra, it's an integral necessity. If television is at least in part where it must be taking place, and if it's not taking place there, we have to ask ourselves the question, what can be done about that? From the very beginning, certainly in my country, when the British Broadcasting Corporation was established, there was an underlying and inherent inconsistency in its mission. As Sir William Mitchell, who was then the Postmaster General in 1926, said, "If you once let politics into broadcasting, you will never be able to keep broadcasting out of politics." So the assumption of early television, public service broadcasting television in particular, in almost every country, was to pretend towards a kind of neutrality and an avoidance of political commitment. In the case of the BBC, an absurd rule called the 14-day rule was introduced in 1926, which lasted for 30 years, incidentally, saying that anything being discussed in Parliament within 14 days could not be discussed on radio and subsequently television. Secondly, there was a non-coverage of elections. Up until the mid-1950s, no election campaign was covered on British television on the grounds that if they tried to cover it, they might bias the result. And thirdly, there was a continuation of a patronising style, initiated on radio, inherited by television, which tended to speak to viewers at the lowest possible level. If there was a single moment that I could point to, certainly in British television history, when this seemed to change, it was on 15th of September 1959, when Granada Television, the television that serves the northwest of England,